Hello, everybody, and welcome back. If you're a return customer to Story and Image, Language of the Soul. I want to start, as usual, with a little video just to set the tone and hopefully inspire. And I'll say a few words about it afterwards. But grab your coffee, let's get coffeeed up and enjoy. Yeah, we're just watching a section of it. We're not going to watch the whole short. So you didn't miss anything. Oh, my. Okay, I'm so sorry to cut that short, but maybe it'll inspire you to watch the whole thing. I am curious, has anyone seen Peter and the Wolf before? If you have or haven't, please put it in the chat. I'm just curious. So Tina, have you seen that or had you seen that?
I have not. It looks amazing.
It?
Yeah. Who produced that?
I don't remember his name, but it's on YouTube, Peter and the Wolf.
Awesome.
And it seems like there was some money behind it. It wasn't a studio, but I don't remember the writer director's name, but really beautiful. And since today is about art direction, I just thought I'd share, something not as slick as a Disney, DreamWorks, PDI, Pixar, Sony Pictures product. It's a little cruder, which I happen to love.
Love that. People in the chat said they love this short.
Oh, really?
They have seen it, yeah.
Yeah, it I think was on several collections, but one of them was, if you know, I'm sure you do, Tina, AWN, Animation World Network. And I think Animation Magazine came out of that. But anyway, they do the show of shows, that festival. And when I
Right.
was in Israel working for Animation Lab, it was the first year we brought it over to Jerusalem, and I just saw it in the festival, and it rocked my world. So yes, I'm glad everybody enjoyed that or has seen it and liked it. There's so many, right? That's why this week was a little difficult to design because, you know, to recap what we've been talking about and then talk about the premise of today, and not to overwhelm you, but to let you know today is going to be a sampler platter, because bringing any intellectual property to life visually ain't no small thing. It's a process. And so I want to focus on all this theoretical story stuff we've been talking about, like Western storytelling structure that informs screenplay format. We're going to talk about in a very practical way how that becomes your art direction. But just know that it's a huge conversation, and that's not meant to overwhelm you. I teach entire 14-week classes during which we bring an intellectual property to life, from moment paintings and story beats to color scripts and color keys. We're going to talk about the difference in a minute, to character designs, and even full model sheets with facial expressions, turnarounds, silhouettes, full painting of the character. And then we tend to put, you know, props, vehicles, weapons in one category. All the assets, since most things are CG now, all the assets needed for the CG pipeline, or if it's 2D, all the assets needed for 2D. But you get what I'm saying. It takes 14 weeks to even dip your toe in the water of coming up with a cohesive art direction. We end that class, by the way, with a style guide, just like you would on production. So after 18 months of pre-production, and we're going to get into the pipeline a little bit, you ideally end with a style guide that the art director then enforces in visiting the different departments every week. So even a 14-week class is a sampler platter. So today is going to be theoretical, but I want to hopefully take everything we've talked about and show you the practical application for it in theory with a couple examples. The rest, and I really want this to land, is doing it. So even some of the quotes from creatives that I've shared over the past 3 weeks, often I think the writers said it most, and Neil Gaiman in particular says, it's all theoretical until you do it, right? And then it means something when you do it. So anyway, I hope you're inspired today, but it is just kind of a toe in the water. Enough explaining. I do, on that front, I'll show you some of the images from the visual development class at Art Center. Now, we may offer something like that, since this is an introductory course to thinking about story and how it can empower your visuals. Whether you're a visual development generalist or you specialize in character design or whatever that niche is that you've identified, I think we've all agreed that a real understanding of story only empowers the work. It doesn't give you, that voice or that flair. Life experience gives you that. And technique can only give you so much. But I promise you, an understanding of story is, in a very practical way, how you infuse what I call like subtext into your images. And the thematic content is communicated in the subtext. So I hope that makes sense theoretically. I'll quickly show you some work. So ironically, just this morning, this came up in Facebook. I had posted all these wonderful children's books a few years ago. Again, it came up as a Facebook memory, but I basically have a lot of favorites from my childhood. Roald Dahl, of course, was one of them, and C.S. Lewis and the Narnia Chronicles and J.R.R. Tolkien. But even before that, like elementary school age, there were stories that rocked my world. On the left, The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster. It just had a depth to it. Even as a kid, I recognized it, And anyway, my sister somehow ended up with not only my Smurfs, but the children's books from my childhood, because she was the first to have kids. So she ended up with all the books. But I did go online to out of print. There's book finders, actually, that can find every single out of print book that's available. Anyway, I bought them all, and I've assigned a couple of these. Phantom Tollbooth on the left, I've assigned A Wrinkle in Time, I've assigned Jerome. And again, just an opportunity for students to develop an intellectual property start to finish, art direction-wise, but also it's really valuable to just see, wow, how every artist in the room interprets the content differently, right? The thematic content hopefully comes across. And I do ask my students to honor what they perceive to be the intent of the writer. But the world is their oyster beyond that. They can change up a lot of circumstances, conditions, exposition, et cetera, to make it relevant for audiences. The irony is, by the way, Phantom Toll Booth, for sure, and I think Jerome could not be more relevant. They were written in the 60s. I read them in the 70s, and man, the themes are so relevant now. So anyway, here's some of the work from those particular intellectual properties and some others like The Little Prince. I actually pick stories that have what we need as grist for the mill, meaning that story arc we talked about, those character arcs we talked about, a want and a need, a want and a higher need, which could be called the goal. You remember everything we've talked about. I look for that. I actually look for a little bit of name recognition so that it's something a studio might conceivably greenlight for production. Not marketability so much, but just literary value and artistic integrity, put it that way. And on the right, you see we do a title treatment also, so that in the portfolio, you can quickly identify a section. Weird, it's showing two at a time. Yeah, it's never happened. I wanna talk about this one for a second. Hopefully you share this opinion or you can wrap your brain around it, but graphic design is really reliant on visual communication. I think that much is not debatable. It's reliant on visual communication. I'm going to offer it's reliant on conceptual visual communication, meaning it's interactive. You have to hopefully, I mean, I guess the best graphic designers like Saul Bass, if you know him, were kind of known for making their images interactive. So you participate as a viewer. There's a little bit of an unanswered question or a sort of, it promises something more or suggests something more. So in that way, it's interactive. And I think that's what we want even in our illustrations and our visual development images. So real quickly, if you would, in the chat, look at the title treatment on the right for Phantom Toll Booth. Whether you know the story or not, it shouldn't matter. What does this promise? You can talk about the demographic, the target audience, maybe the genre or the format you think it's going to be. Is it going to be TV animation, a series? Is it going to be a feature? You can talk about that, but I'm more interested in what do you think the story is about thematically? Does anything come to mind for you guys when you see this image? Tina,
I'm just waiting.
Okay.
Maybe they need some more time or some more input.
There's no wrong answer. How about, is anyone out there? How about that?
No, they're out there. Somebody said traveling, a journey. Somebody said being a Doctor Who. So a toll booth makes me think of traveling. Someone said time traveling.
I wonder why, out of curiosity, why time? I would be curious. Anything else?
I get road and being on a road and blocked.
Blocked entry. Yeah, well, there's a lot of red and there's literally a red light.
There's a red light, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to tell if the green is lit or if the red is lit, but I would agree with all of that. Some of them were rather literal, if that makes sense. Like a road trip movie is different than saying it's a road trip movie, you know, like a buddy flick about bonding under crisis. You know, the latter would be the thematic content. So now tell me what that means. If it seems to be about traffic or a journey, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what could it be about in life? What does that symbolize? Remember the example of Wizard of Oz? She just needed to click her heels together. Oz could not send her home to Kansas. Symbolic for she shouldn't look outside herself for tranquility, inner peace, well-being. She had all the goods within. There's a metaphorical level and then there's the literal level. So all the adjectives you guys came up with, what does that mean about life? Anything?
Yeah, Suman says, I think something hiding behind the road. And John said growth and transformation. Elisa says coming of age story. And David Gardner mentions finding direction in life, a way out of chaos.
I love it, exactly. So I do think it communicates that. You automatically have a visceral gut level feeling about confusion or choices or journey, yeah, something like that. So thank you for that. Thanks for indulging me. I do wish the one on the left was a little bigger because I just love it. That ended up in the gallery at Art Center. I just love the straights to curves, the short strokes to the long strokes, the stretch to the compression, all those things that make for just wonderful shape design. Not to mention the gestures, right? And the character designs themselves. The one on the right is from the BFG. So before they made the film, if you remember BFG, the live action film, I assigned it. It was one of the lesser known stories from Roald Dahl, yes? Yeah, Roald Dahl. But anyway, I clearly had my finger on the pulse because I assigned it, then they made it. And actually the same with The Little Prince, when they did that CG / live action remake, I had just assigned it. I should be an acquisitions person, right, at the studios. I should be a creative executive. I love these. That's from The Little Prince. This is from The Alchemist. I've assigned it several times. I tried to give them a break for a few years, then I might bring them back, but I've assigned this quite a bit. That's actually Jeff Palm. He became a background painter at Warner Brothers. I think he's might even be art directing now. That's Jeff Palm on the left again. It's a guy named Jenneth on the left. I'm not going to remember everybody. All right. Oh, oops, I knew there was more. And by the way, they did have the option of making it episodic. It didn't have to be a feature. So there's a lot of freedom in the class, and it really was so valuable just seeing the different interpretations of the IP. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. That's Kevin Chen. No, Kevin Kwan, sorry. Kevin Chia Kwan on the bottom right. Oh, and this is the story by Neil Gaiman that I think I was telling you about, Tina. It's a lesser known short story from his collection, Smoke and Mirrors. And I just love the results from this one. Chock full of not just archetypes, but literally really familiar symbols like the Holy Grail, things that took some research, for people to get to the bottom of the original iconography, which to me isn't as important as the sort of more universally human archetypes that speak to the human condition. The culturally relative ones I don't think are that interesting, but they do provide authenticity and texture and ambiance if you research them. There's the Holy Grail there. All right, nearing the end here. Yeah, they're so small, I'm sorry. Anyway, so in the class, we do all the assets, like I said, layouts, backgrounds, character designs, color keys and color scripts, moment paintings, and story beats. There's plenty more that we're going to talk about in a minute that sort of comes into play in the production pipeline. Anyway, hope you enjoyed those. We may or may not run something like that through CTN Knowledge, but I want you to just keep in mind, it is in the doing it where a lot of this, you'll find out for yourself how to practically apply some of the theoretical story content that we talked about. And now I would love, so Tina, before we move on in terms of practically applying all the story information to art direction, I do want to follow up from last week. We got 3 really great stories, so thank you for participating. For those of you that wrote your own myth, the assignment was to write your life as a myth. I kept it very simple for a reason. So I said either write the myth of your life or write your life as a myth. And I didn't say a whole lot more than that. So I got 3 really great stories and I'd love to share them. So John and Sammy, and who was the third person, Tina? I'm so sorry. If the 3 of you who submitted, if you're open to sharing them, please speak up. And if you're not, please speak up. I am glad to read them. John, is John out there, Patterson?
John Patterson is here.
John, would you like to read your story or shall I? Because I'd love to share it if you're open to it.
He says, read away, Dominick.
I'll give it my best. Forgive me if I screwed up. I really love these, by the way, Sammy. Yours was really beautiful. It brought a tear to my eyes. And same, John, yours was awesome. Long ago, in a mysteriously magic place called the City of Angels, A young man and woman from different tribes met and fell in love. Their families bitterly forbade the new couple's union. The parents of the daughter disowned her and cast her out of the village for marrying outside of their clan. On this very night, a one-fanged reptilian spirit, an angelic being, watched the proceedings from behind a small bush. The one-fanged lizard was saddened to see the parents scorn their firstborn daughter and shed a few tiny tears. Being a fledgling half-angel lizard spirit and somewhat mischievous, it decided to intervene. The lizard half-angel gently touched the dress of the woman. I like your compound words. The lizard half-angel gently touched the dress of the woman, casting a magic fertility blessing on her as she walked away from her family into the dark of night. After the young couple had married, they were indeed blessed with several children, especially a curious boy born with one fang, and maybe a little bit of reptilian magic as well. I love it. Thank you, John. That was awesome. And I want to ask you, maybe you first, John, and then Sammy and the other participant, if you would like, if you'd share what, if anything, it brought up for you. What was the experience like writing your own myth? There's no right or wrong, or you may not have thought about it, but did it serve you in any way? Last 2 weeks ago was about catharsis. Last week was about archetypes. So I noticed some of you did employ archetypes, but they were very much couched, right, in contemporary culture and not disguised at all. You know, the words animation industry were used in Sammy's beautiful, beautiful piece, but there is an archetype underlying some of the imagery. So anyway, no right or wrong answer, but John, did you, I don't know, what was your experience in writing it? Anything worth sharing?
I think the myth that really stuck with me a lot. And let's see. I started connecting it to my life and how some of my family was kind of, they were very judgmental and kind of kept to themselves. And yes, and I was born with a fang. So there you go. That's all.
Nice.
Thanks.
Well, you're kind of reiterating the story. I mean, I think it was pretty clear, you know what I mean? Like, we can fill in gaps, and I don't want to get too personal, but I think it's pretty clear what it was about. I just wondered if you experienced a catharsis at all, or if you made any realizations, or if it was healing, or if it was helpful, or if it was just your typical creative process. Do you know what I mean? When we write about ourselves, but specifically somehow in this mythic format, there's all kinds of implications, and it can kind of guide you into new territory. You don't have to make something up if it didn't happen, but I just wondered, in your creative process, was there anything of note, or did it feel like your typical creative process?
I found it kind of exciting that once I did like a little quick draft, and I know it's just a short paragraph, but I started to connect some of the things that you've talked about. And good. I think it was sort of, maybe it was cathartic, but it was sort of, I don't know if healing's the right word, but it meant something because I was able to go back and look at my parents who did experience that kind of thing. You know, their families didn't believe in their marriage and stuff. And they came from different cultures and stuff. So it was cathartic in that I was learning how to apply some of the story elements, I think, for me.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I like that. That's a good outcome in my book. Some clarifying, that could be, you know, instead of catharsis or healing, just sometimes clarifying, just writing it down can be clarifying. But it sounds like you weren't in denial about any of it. Nothing new came up. But I do like that in your craft, do you know what I mean? You were able to take a slightly new approach. Thank you for participating. I'm going to ask Sammy. Oh, yeah, of course. Sammy, are you willing to chat a little bit? Can we turn Sammy's mic on? I'm going to make an executive decision and just read it for her while she's turning her mic on. Unless there's a major objection. Okay, there once was a girl who had no home. It's really beautiful, guys, so pay attention. There was once a girl who had no home. When she was a little girl, her family moved away from the land they had lived for centuries. The land by the lake. They moved far away to a new place, the land in the trees. And though they lived there a long time, the girl never felt at home there either. She was different from all the people in the land of the trees. She acted differently, dressed differently, even dreamed differently. I love that. She longed to return to the home of her family, the land by the lake, until one day she was told her family hadn't even lived in the land by the lake for very long. The centuries she was told her ancestors lived there were more like decades. With no place to call home, the girl went away to school in the city, hoping to find her home there. She met friends and thought she finally belonged when she realized she was still different. Finally, the girl traveled far, far, farther than she ever had traveled until she could travel no more. She had come to the ocean. So the girl found a home with people like me, her, maybe. But after a few years, the girl realized she was still different from the people in this place. Hopeless, the girl didn't know what to do. She couldn't turn back to the land by the lake, or the land of the trees, or the city, and she couldn't go any further. Then one day the girl sat down and she thought. She thought and thought and thought and tried to think of the most at home she had ever felt. And then the girl realized it was in stories. The girl had felt most at home while reading a book or watching a movie. When the girl read these books and watched these movies, she didn't feel so different. She felt like there was someone out there who thought like her and felt like her, because they had made a story where she felt at home. Then she had an epiphany. If she didn't have a home, maybe there were other people who didn't have homes. Maybe there were other people like her who felt different. And maybe these people wrote and filmed and illustrated and animated stories to help other people not feel alone. So the girl worked hard. It didn't happen all at once, and she had a lot of obstacles to overcome. But she had already come this far. How could she stop now? Then one day she made it. She walked into an animation studio where she found people who felt just like her, who felt differently and quirky and homeless. But together they made stories that made them feel at home. I'm getting choked up. And other people who watched it feel at home too. And that's when the girl realized home isn't a place. It's a feeling, a sense of belonging and connection with those around you. Home can be anywhere, as long as the people who make you feel at home are there with you. Well, I didn't think I'd get all teary-eyed. It's really beautiful. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Wizard of Oz template. I mean, I think there's many stories on the home is where you make it. Family is where you make it. We're going to talk about Tarzan in a little bit. Home is where you make it. But to me, it felt like a little bit like Wizard of Oz in that everything you need is in your own backyard. So despite home, circumstances, geography, location, we do have the goods to be content within. Anyway, is your sound on?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello, thank you for that. It's really beautiful.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I didn't think that you guys would actually read it. I thought that for me, it was just, like you said, like kind of a cathartic exercise.
Well, if it was too personal, sorry for sharing it, but yeah, I had hoped if there were any objections, people would speak up in advance. But I think a lot of artists will relate to it. You know, a lot of animation artists will relate to it. So thank you for allowing me to share it. Did you have any, what was your, I mean, again, no wrong answer, but what was your process? What did you experience when writing it, if anything?
So if you can't tell by how many times I use the word home, it's a theme that's been on my mind a lot lately. This August will mark 4 years since I've been in Los Angeles. And this past, year with the pandemic, it's the furthest I've ever been away from my family. Mm-hmm. So I feel like this whole year has really been making me think like, what is home? Like, do I feel at home here? Is it back in, I'm from Indiana. So is it back in Indiana with my family? Like, what is that? And like kind of through my process, like you said, just writing it out, I did kind of realize that it's like you said, it's like home is where you make it. And it's funny that you said Wizard of Oz, because I feel like that story tends to come up a lot in my life. It was it was the first like theater production I ever worked on in high school. And like,
wait, I missed one word. I'm so sorry. What was it that
Wizard of Oz.
Wizard of Oz, okay.
Yeah. So it's just been like a theme I was thinking of, and then I saw the assignment and I was like, oh, this might be a good chance to kind of, work my thoughts out. And it was, and I'm really happy that it connected so deeply.
I'm sure. I mean, if anyone wants
hopefully others.
Yeah, if anyone wants to write in the chat, if you related to it, I think the answer is going to be a resounding yes. Again, having taught for 20 years and actually interviewed my students for a documentary, I don't think we're all from one mold necessarily. There's a lot of diversity among animation artists, but I do think what you wrote about is pretty universal. So thank you for sharing it. It's really beautiful. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do think often when we write, it is clarifying. It's not like you come up with a policy for moving forward necessarily, but sometimes you make realizations, and that's all I would hope for anyone in writing. It can be that.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Good. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I'm going to read the third one real quick. Again, unless I keep forgetting this participant's name. I'm so sorry. But unless this person has any objections, I'll quickly read it.
Can we find out who the person is? Is their name on it?
I don't have it available. I'm sorry. Alicia said it a moment ago, but I forgot. I'm a bad boy. Once upon a time lived a young girl with a big dream about becoming an artist. But everything changed when an evil witch cursed her with disease, and other folks made fun of her. She started to doubt herself, but with support from her family, she overcame all obstacles and achieved great things. So this person took it very seriously when I said a paragraph or a short page. I like how concise it is. My question for all of you would be, do you see this? Not everything lends itself, right, to feature format. Not everything is going to have all those components on the story arc for a 3-act structure. I wonder if any of you feel it could become a short film that's more conceptual and non-linear. If any of you feel the story you wrote maybe lends itself to an episodic premise, because usually anything that spans several seasons and has mini arcs within each episode has an overarching story arc, if that makes sense. Anyway, I just wonder if you could plug in some of the things we've talked about, like want and need. I'm sure you already identified main themes. I think belonging, family, and again, we're going to talk about Tarzan, and maybe this idea of family is where you make it will click a little more. But some of the themes I heard in those two stories are very universal. I mean, in John's, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it seems like it's about alienation, connection, identifying, bonding, disenfranchisement, marginalization, prejudice, a lot of really universal things. So anyway, I just wonder if you feel like the components are there, and if they're not, there's certainly strong thematic content. Could you strengthen or clarify a want and a need if you wanted to? Just think about it. And then again, later, if we do a class, maybe this becomes your vehicle, or maybe it's just an exercise for you, but it maybe lights a fire and you do more writing. Who knows? Again, thank you so much for sharing, guys. I think they were all beautiful and there was no right or wrong with that assignment, but I think it fulfilled our purposes very well. So thank you, guys. I'm going to move on to the bulk of the presentation, and there will be more participation. I hate to tell you that. I would love for you guys to participate, and when I prompt you, put your responses in the chat. I'm going to first show you 7 images. I mean, many images, but 7 slides of images. I want you to consider the 3 groups, how they differ from one another. This, and this are group 1. So look at these images as a group. Think about what they might have in common. These 2. As compared to this group. This and this together. Don't worry, I'll go over them again. And the third group, you have 3 slides. It's this, this, and this. So take these in. I'll go through the last group one more time. This, and this. Again, there is no wrong answer here, so please don't be afraid to chime in or participate. I'll go over them all once again. This is group 1, these images, and these together, group one. Group two are these two. And group three would be this, this, and this. This, and this. Do you see a difference? Is there a difference? Content-wise, I don't want to say too much.
Yeah, some people are saying things, I guess, about group one. They said humans, and then they said documentary versus story versus subconscious. And someone else says it is surreal.
Love it. Actually, the second response, documentary versus narrative versus subconscious. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
That hits closest to what I'm suggesting here. There is no wrong answer, but think about it. I mean, I could slightly reword it, but why? Would you agree these are sort of academic representational images, right? They're either, when you think about it, when you draw from the model, when you do a plein air painting, when you do a still life, you're largely representing what's in front of you. Of course, there's interpretation involved, right? There can be expressive strokes, there are color choices. You are not maybe stylizing what you see, but you're certainly interpreting it. And then medium and technique bring their own, I think, departures from literalism or reality. So there's always a degree of expressiveness or interpretation, but they are by definition representational. We also call that figural. So somebody said humans, I think, and that probably speaks to the figural aspect of this. So we're not here to define everything, but my understanding is representational versus abstract. Then within representational, you have figurative, means it is something, and then figural means it's a human figure. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say group one, Elisa says the gaze painterly seductive corporeal. And group three, David says, seems to have more visual metaphor.
Exactly, right. So everything, all your responses do kind of fit together, just different words, right?
Yeah, group two, suffering, despair, need. Group three, surrealism, imagination.
Love it, yeah. I mean, again, that response got a little more into content, the pain and the suffering, which was not my intention, but I can't argue, I see it too. So anyway, but let's stick to the premise here. Very simple, by definition, these are academic and representational, some of them figural, some not. Meaning the tree is not figural, it's figurative, but it's not figural. Doesn't matter, these are academic. These are narrative. Several people hinted at that, you are correct. There's a story being told. There's a character interacting in an environment we recognize, a three-dimensional environment. Character interacting in environment, that's narrative. It could be literal, right? It could be from a story. I see a Bible, I think that's a Caravaggio image there of, is that John Christ or John the Baptist? Who knows? And I think that's an N.C. Wyeth image, probably from a novel, right? I think that's a Dure etching of, I'm guessing, Moses holding up the tablets. There's a Hunchback image on the bottom. And then this third one, I agree with you guys. They're very surreal. They transport, they're dreamlike. I think someone said visual metaphor, but the word I'm going to put to it, they're conceptual. Does that land with you? Do you guys agree? Kind of? Conceptual, narrative, and representational. So I don't think any of this is particularly new to you, but you may not have had it drilled into your head the way I did at Art Center. So being a dinosaur, I went from 89 to 91. And literally, just before I got there, Matt Mahurin, Greg Spolenka, Arisman, a bunch of illustrators had just graduated, made a big splash in New York, and defined what we now call conceptual editorial illustration. So editorial illustration had existed, since the turn of the century, at least in this country. And a lot of magazine articles were accompanied by illustrations rather than photography. It's a whole tradition. But this conceptual approach to illustrating, as opposed to a narrative one, really hit its stride in, again, the early 80s, so that when I came along in 89, that's what was being taught. So it's what it sounds like. I think visual metaphor was the reply we got that made the most sense. I was taught, God forbid, and this is why it's a miracle that anyone in my class made it into entertainment. especially animation, because it was forbidden to show the narrative. God forbid you show a narrative, a character interacting in a convincing environment. Rather, you're meant to show the shadow on the wall that symbolizes it. You don't show the heads of state at the table battling it out. You show the mice under the table, metaphorically battling it out. You show the moment before, you show the moment after. Use symbolism to create a metaphor that is reminiscent of the content of the article. So I wish we had more time. There's an exercise I often do where I give the tagline of an article. I'll give you one quick example. It's great for workshops, but let's say I gave you a Time magazine article that reads, and it is up to the illustrator, by the way, to interpret. They're being hired for their interpretation of the article and to illustrate an image that A, intrigues the reader to read the article, but also promises something about it and encapsulates the concept of the article as the illustrator sees it. They're being paid for their vision. So anyway, in the exercise I have, if there's time, they read an article and then they encapsulate it in a single sort of log line. If not, I provide the log lines in these workshops. Imagine one in which the log line is modern medicine treats symptoms and not root causes. Look at all the images that are automatically in there already. Root. I mean, it's a word, but figuratively, an image comes to mind. So we highlight key words in that phrase and we write down the associated images, just like we did last week in that exercise when I gave you the concept and you wrote the attached percept, if you remember that. So anyway, we write down the keywords, then we write a bunch of synonyms for each keyword. Root could have a bunch of, capillary, tributaries, veins, like there's a lot of possible synonyms for root alone. Then with all those words, we come up with associated images. They may not immediately sort of fit together in a conceptual image that immediately communicates the concept of the article, but when you sleep on it and you germinate on it, like puzzle pieces, they settle. The perfect image always arrives through inspiration. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. How the hell does this apply to entertainment? Well, for 20 years of my teaching at Art Center, the stuff that really does jump off the wall when it comes to grad show, for example, when students are graduating, they put their work on the wall or in a portfolio. The consensus is, even for the non-entertainment instructors, the fine art instructors and product design instructors, graphic design instructors, the consensus always tends to be the work that really resonates is the narrative work that's not literal. So if it's entertainment work, you don't just honor the script by putting 3 ice cubes in the glass if that's what's demanded. You bring a conceptual level to it that invites participation, like those title treatments we talked about, like Saul Bass. It invites an interactivity. Does that make sense a little bit, you guys? So allowing yourself to use visual metaphor, use symbolism to create subtext and therefore resonance rather than being literal. I'll leave it at that for a moment. We're going to look at some examples and hopefully some of this will click a little more. I'm just giving you a little hint. Like we talk about flair a lot and voice and what makes work stand out. That comes up a lot. It is not going to be craft. A lot of people can learn their color theory. A lot of people can learn compositional skills, even cinematic composition and film language. A lot of people, there are really great draftsmen out there that actually might even have something to say, or they might have stories in them, but they may not connect at all. And so I'm just gently offering the stuff, again, that does tend to stand out as having that flair. It's because there's subtext. And we'll leave it at that for now. I would love a little more participation on this one. This is obviously a layout from Hunchback. That's the finished production background, or a bad scan of it anyway. I want to use this as our little exercise. Exercise. Try to forget about color for the moment. Let's leave that out of the equation because color is really powerful emotionally. Don't worry, we'll get to it. And then try to get the story out of your brain. If you've seen Hunchback or read it, try to get that out of your brain and just think on a formal property level, on an abstract level, how does it make me feel? Forget about the intellectual stuff, the narrative, the story you already know. Just how does it make you feel by virtue of its pure design? There's no wrong answer here, but adjectives would be great. It could be reciprocal. I feel ... or it is ... No wrong answer. So it is blank or I feel blank. Any adjectives come to mind?
Yeah, they're starting to come in. Sammy says dread, fear, and intimidation.
Yep, love it.
Elisa says it is towering. Ditum says it is magnificence. Jonathan said, I feel like it is resistant to change. Huh?
Love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, staunch. Well, I'm guessing a little bit of the story, the narrative came, I don't know. Like, I'm trying to go for this. I don't want to make any presumptions, but I think we all agree, yeah, the fucking Catholic Church, is really slow to change. But if you didn't recognize that as the bell towers of Notre Dame, if you didn't recognize that as a Catholic abbey, you would probably still feel that, because a pyramid is unchangeable. It doesn't topple, it doesn't sway. You know what I mean? We're going for literally without the intellectual mind involved, but it's almost hard to unknow what you know, right? It's hard to unknow the narrative. I'm guessing both resulted in that answer. Anything else, Tina?
Yeah, more came in. Oppressed, insignificant, lofty.
Wow, right.
David said
it is lofty, therefore I feel insignificant.
Aha.
Right, it's reciprocal. It is, I feel.
Nice. Someone said it is foreboding. Dagmara says sadness. Jonathan said squares are a very stable shape.
Right. So you're getting the idea. And again, sorry if this doesn't seem like rocket science, but it is worth talking about. I mean, even at Art Center, they're pretty sophisticated. They're not babes in the woods. They've had some mileage, but there's still a learning curve sometimes. Because, for example, when we analyze the hell out of it and go, okay, what design decisions resulted in those feelings you just listed? I've had a student literally say, oh, come on, did they think about all that? And I said, of course, consciously or subconsciously. Of course, their layout artists are so seasoned that all the stuff we're talking about hopefully comes out second nature. But whether it's conscious or subconscious, it is all working, even if it's projected on afterwards. So you know what I mean? It's worth talking about. So anybody want to put in the chat, why? What formal properties of this design, don't mention a church, don't mention Catholicism, don't mention Hunchback, nothing intellectual, but on a design level, by virtue of the composition, the shape language, the juxtaposition, the ratio of light to dark, things like that. What design decisions resulted in the adjectives you came up with? You already hinted to that. I heard pyramid is stable, square shapes are stable, perfect. Anything else come to mind? Like, why did you come up with the adjectives you came up with?
They're starting to come in. Elisa says camera distortion. Sammy says the perspective, makes me feel small.
I want to pursue that one real quick, Tina. Hold on to others if there are any. But again, when we think, if we want to extract the intellectual mind from the equation and go to the fundamental, the innate reactions we have to formal properties. You may remember last week we talked about circle, red, black. Didn't have to be a snake or a lamb or an eagle. Just a color or just a shape could evoke similar reactions. So the intellectual mind understands perspective, right? We look at this and we go, okay, the orthogonals are converging to a vanishing point. There are 3 vanishing points, therefore I'm looking up at it, therefore I feel intimidated. Because when I was a child, I always had to look up at things and I felt the authority, blah, 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 like that's all intellectual. Do you realize that the choice to do this in 3-point perspective, it could have been done in 2-point, but the choice to do it in 3-point is what created the pyramidal composition. That's what we're feeling, not any of the intellectual stuff, right? And the fact, I wish I had a pointer like I do in class, but the fact that the point of the pyramid is almost tangent with the edge of the composition. Tangencies create tension by definition. If you think of a bunch of rocks with no overlap in the composition, they're not overlapping, that means there is literally potential energy harnessed in every contact point. Tension is created subconsciously because there's a very physical reality to it. Hope that made sense. Now imagine this in 2-point perspective. If the layout artist had chosen to be lazy and do it in 2-point, it would still be an upshot. the intellectual mind would still go, okay, the perspective tells me I'm looking up at something. But you wouldn't feel as intimidated, or you wouldn't project so much authority or power or stability to that institution that can't be toppled, because it wouldn't be a pyramid. Further, if it was in 2-point, do you see how the tops of the bell towers would probably parallel the top of the picture plane? You could still what's called Dutch the camera or cant the camera to eliminate horizontals, but that's very static as a choice. So the pyramid would go out of it. Maybe the stability, if that was the goal, the stability of the Catholic Church would benefit from horizontals that sort of lock it into the picture plane, but probably not. I think we need the dynamism of this to make it feel powerful and sort of throw off our equilibrium and make it a little less predictable. Things are only, I think, menacing, like a villain or a tall building, if there's a degree of unpredictability about it. Anyway, anything else worth talking about, Tina?
There are. David says, oops, it just slipped just a moment. There we go. David said, makes me feel we're reaching to heaven with colors in the sky, but dark values of the structures keep me stuck on the ground on Earth.
Love it. So look at,
go ahead.
real quickly, just to analyze it, look at the ratio of lights to dark. I have my students, if we were in the same classroom, I'd have you break this down into just black and white, a figure ground relationship. Then I'd have you break it down into 3 values, black, white, and gray. And pretty much everybody comes up with the same interpretation, but try to analyze what you would make black, what you would make gray, and what you would make white. So you will notice in the black and white icon, of course, it's not quite 3/4 positive space or dark, but almost. That's a dominance of dark values. It's going to be more oppressive, right? With the dominance of dark values. Since they're at the bottom of the composition, it is very grounding and stabilizing. Imagine, I guess I can, hold on 1 second. Never, it's not worth it. But imagine if I flopped this upside down. All those points, which nobody's mentioned yet, shape language, all the points would be converging downward on the composition. The negative space or the lighter values would be at the bottom. We would feel trapped, especially if there was a little tiny character at the bottom, hint, hint. So do you see how the lighter values at the top, there's a little bit of escape. I mean, hope is visually represented often when the lighter values are relegated to the top of the composition. So simply put, I'm just calling that the ratio of lights to darks, but also the juxtaposition of the lights and darks, the placement of them. So I'm agreeing with everything you guys have said. I'm just telling you the sort of design principles behind what you said. Anything else?
Yeah, this is great. I love the interaction. John said, angles and sharp pointed forms create feelings of danger.
Of course, I'm going to follow up on that just because,
Okay.
just to kind of get
Love
to the
it.
point we go on. But I love it. Thank you, John. Yes, it's angular. Some people have pointed out, but the populace are being oppressed by the Catholic Church. The populace, meaning the little, actually French provincial cottages, have the spikes. They're not the bad guy. The bottom line is we feel it. Again, imagine if it was upside down, we would feel really encroached upon. And even the negative spaces of the sky are sharp and angular. So it would be better if the menacing party, the Catholic Church, were spiky, but it ain't. I hope you get the idea. We still feel it. Anything else?
David says the shapes of the rooftop towers point upward.
Mm-hmm.
The shapes of the roof towers point upward.
Right. And I'm guessing that gives it power and authority, or, yeah.
And Didem says the perfectionism in the details of the facade makes it almost unrealistic for me, hence magnificence.
Nice. Well, I can't disagree. I mean, the ornate quality says something. We're trying to go, into the simple design here and not the details within the shapes, but I get it. I totally agree. The last thing I want to point out, since we said let's leave color, aside for the moment, of course it's playing a huge part. Color is probably the most powerful when it comes to visceral emotion tool that we can use with our audiences. Some people have pointed out that particular yellow vibrates with the cyan next to it, right? It's kind of jarring. It's uncomfortable. We don't often see, right? The sky is usually flooded with warmth if the clouds are going to be that saturated toward the yellow and the yellow-orange. It does happen, but it's vibrates. So there's no denying there's a lurid, you know, a little slightly toxic feeling to this palette, but maybe not for some, who knows. But I do want to point out the sky. What role is the sky playing very quickly? Does anybody have any comment on the BG level? Not hint, hint, the underlays or the overlays, but the background. Is it playing a role at all?
I feel the mood of the story like I'm entering into a gorgeous dark in a dusk time.
See, it is kind of pretty. I mean, I said lurid and disturbing, but it is kind of pretty. Or romantic. I mean, I have a goth sensibility, so just like Pan's Labyrinth, like I want to be in the beautiful dark. I see the beauty in the decay and the shadow and the darkness. So to me, it is beautiful. But what else? Without so much talking about color, what role is the sky playing in our fundamental visceral response to this simple composition?
The building leads my eye up to the sky, implying a connection to heaven.
Interesting. Well, yeah, I wonder if that was conscious on the part of the layout artist. No doubt. I mean, there are themes throughout Hunchback of he's elevated for a reason. You know, the downtrodden are the closest to God. So I think it's throughout the novel and it's throughout the film. Anyway, I'll just cover this one real quick. Notice some people say, oh, the clouds are curvilinear, they're puffy, they're friendly, they're non-threatening compared to the spiky shapes, right? That is true. But imagine you don't recognize the yin without the yang. If everything was angular, nothing is angular. I mean, if everything's angular, yeah, nothing's threatening or nothing's angular. So the yin always plays against the yang. You appreciate the spiky shapes because they're played against curvilinear shapes. An example I use, I wish I had a chalkboard. I'm so used to having one in class, but imagine a whole composition of nothing but upturned triangles. Let's call them trees. Let's call them pine trees, but just a bunch of triangles. Then there's one little circle on the hint horizon behind the triangles, the moon or the sun. Your eye goes to the differentiating shape. That will be the focal point no matter what, without value, without color. Hope that makes sense. The other thing that's been pointed out, now imagine if you designed this and for whatever reason, you just didn't think of using the sky toward your purposes. You have a list of adjectives, by the way. In my classes, whether it's a character design or a background, I have them literally list the emotional content of the scene. When a new scene flashes on screen, and I got this from Maurice Hunt, by the way, Pijot, if you know him, Tina, he came and lectured over 20 years ago in my class when I first started teaching it. And he said this, and it's always stuck with me. The minute a new scene appears on screen in a film, you have a feeling. Long before a word is spoken, long before there's any business, blocking, action, you already have a feeling. Let's be in control of that. A great layout artist is in control of that, and a great colorist is in control of that. Hope that makes sense. So the feeling is largely in the subconscious and in the intuitive on the part of the artist. So imagine if you were doing this and you weren't seasoned as a layout artist and you just, for whatever reason, just did horizontal clouds paralleling the horizon. You're not using every tool in your toolbox, you follow? The diagonals, even though the mini curves make up the diagonals, we feel the dynamism of that, and it conflicts with some of the other angles, which energizes the composition and makes us feel rather uneasy. So tangencies cause tension, but so do conflicting angles and randomness and chaos. Does that make sense, you guys? Diagonals.
I think so.
I think if they were horizontal, it would be placid, it would be too stable. We want to feel a little off, like there's some danger here. All right, we've beaten that one to death. Thank you so much for the participation. But here is kind of an example of all of that. Wish we had more time, but look, I guess this could be a handout that we put in the on the ongoing list.
On the resource list, this would be amazing.
Yeah. So look quickly if you can see my pointer. Oh. So horizontals speaks for itself. Diagonals, look how, even though it's still organic subject matter, there's still a very stabilizing horizon. These diagonals activate the composition. That's what I was getting at with the clouds in the last one. Spiral, alluring, seductive, mesmerizing, meditative, surreal, blah, blah, blah. Curves, obviously soothing, pleasing, inviting, fun, familiar, endearing, whimsical, friendly, comfortable. Some people said whole, safe, You get the idea. Now, this is exactly what we've been talking about, the sharp angles and points. On the last one, even though they belonged to the villagers and not the Catholic Church, we still felt them. They were upturned, not downturned. Do you see how much more menacing it is when they're downturned now? And that little fire that feels so lonely inside of this ice cave still feels vulnerable, right? Because it's low in the composition and all those angles point down. But you're not using every tool in your toolbox. Here, not only are they pointing down, they're converging on the focal point. They're converging on the subject. So slightly different. Sharp angles and points are one thing, but here converging points are another. And weighting down the top of the composition rather than the bottom, as we spoke about before. Anyway, you get the idea. Quickly, opposing angles and tangencies. I mentioned a bunch of rocks with no overlap. You will feel, I'm gonna try to zoom in. Yeah, you will feel the tension. Look at this. See how that is a tangency by definition, no overlap. Same here. This thing is chock full of tangencies. Same there. Same here. It's not only tangent with the other line, but it's tangent with the picture plane or the edge of the composition. Pretty much everywhere. So there's a tension in that. And we do it. We try to avoid them because spatial relationships get confused, right? If you're doing Sleeping Beauty and the idea is to create a flatness, we're going to talk about it in a minute. You want to create a stained glass window or a tapestry effect, then go for it. Do all the stacked perspective you want. Do zero overlaps. But within reason, we're trying to create clarity as far as spatial relationships. Sometimes we do this for the tension factor, and we throw spatial relationships out the window. Okay, radiating lines speaks for itself. Looks like a Hallmark card, right? All right. So again, just trying to cover some ground real quick, and there is way more we could go into with each one of these topics. So one thing I introduced, I am trying to offer things that aren't normally covered or talked about. I mean, I've even seen storyboarding classes that don't go into film language. I don't get it, frankly. But because I'm a live action filmmaker and I'm hyper aware of where animation borrows from live action in terms of cinematography and film language, I talk about it. So real quickly, there's 3 categories I get people to think about. If you're a storyboard artist, and most of you probably have boarded sequences, every panel, whether you know it or not, you're making a decision about fielding, vantage point, and shot type. So real quickly, vantage point is what it sounds like. Is it bird's eye or worm's eye or eye level or anything in between? There's even something called a sandbag shot, which is in live action, you don't put the camera on the ground, you set it on a sandbag. So that's the equivalent of worm's eye, or maybe even more extreme. Then vantage point, then fielding in animation is what we call extreme long shot, medium shot, medium close-up, extreme close-up. And here you have some horrible examples of how in live action, it's often based on the size of the character. All these silly rules, like, a long shot will cut them off at the shin, but an extreme long shot, they'll look the size of an ant. In animation, we still give it a name, even if it's just like in Pinocchio, a beautiful background of some candles on a mantle. We still have to give it a name, so it's not so much about the size of the character. But anyway, that would be fielding. How tight or wide is it, and why, right? Imagine that shot in Prince of Egypt, the little tear that falls from that woman's eye. Remember the Bedouin woman? The little tear falls from her eye. We wouldn't feel the intimacy of that had it been a medium shot. It required an extreme close-up. So fielding, how tight or wide, and why. And then the shot type is very simple. Here you notice you have simple, complex, and evolving. Simple means there's no camera mechanic. It's just what we call on sticks or on a tripod. It's static. Complex means it has one camera mechanic. A pan, a push in, you get the idea. We can't go into all of it. And then an evolving shot means it has a little bit of both. Maybe it pans right while pushing in. A lot of establishing shots when you're first seeing the witch's castle, for example. Very good reason to pan over the villagers that she's oppressing, then push in on the castle where the witch actually lives. Hopefully you see the many, reasons you might want to use an evolving shot. Okay, and then some terms, and again, we'll put this in the resources list. Okay, so to get to the nuts and bolts of art direction, speeding up here, it's necessary, I think, to talk about how a film gets made. Now, again, on smaller experimental films or student films or even animated shorts, you're going to see many, many variations on it. But I think it's good to talk about the feature pipeline and then just know there's a difference between traditional and CG, of course, or 2D and 3D, if you want to call it that. There's a different pipeline, a much faster pipeline in TV. So all kinds of variations. But in a feature, which is, I think, worth talking about, as you know, a story can be in development for 20 years, in and out of development for 20 years. I always heard that at Disney, Tina. I don't know if you did, Tina. I always heard it and didn't quite believe it until I got old enough to see it for myself. Meaning the Britzy brothers were working on Snow Queen before I left. I worked for 5 minutes with them on the 3rd floor because I was up there during Little Match Girl. And it was just called Snow Queen, and I thought it was dead in the water at one point, and then I left Disney, and all these years later, Tangled came out. It was what became of Snow Queen. So it's very true. They can go in and out of development for 20 years. Once they're not greenlit for production, but approved for pre-production, you generally have or had 18 months of pre-production, 18 months of production. So pre-production is what it sounds like, getting the art direction solid, hopefully culminating in a style guide that'll be used to enforce said art direction, production, and there are what are called front-end positions and back-end. Front end would be like boarding. You got to have it all boarded out, but sometimes because of story changes, they'll remain on quite long in the process. Backgrounds is a back end. We stay on till the very last minute. And Mike Giamo has said, as an art director, he's there until the apocalypse because he's got to go approve the color timing. I mean, no, it's not video anymore, but for the video and for streaming, he, as art director, has to approve every iteration of the film. So art director stays on long after it's fun, according to Mike. All right, so very practically, let's talk about all this theoretical stuff regarding story. How does it affect our design decisions? Whether we're a production designer, an art director, a visual development generalist, or just a biz dev artist that specializes in something like color scripting, character design, you name it. I think color is again, can be one of the most emotional tools in your toolbox, but I think it's the most clear-cut one to talk about the influence of a really well understood story. So hopefully you agree, even the public tends to notice color and comment on it. Like they may not, my friend Larry, he's an IT guy. He is an IT guy. I mean, and we went to, I think, Madagascar way back in the day. And I walked out and I didn't love the art direction of it, to be honest. So I said something like, did you notice the models were ... I said something and he goes, the what? I said, the models, the 3D models. He didn't even know the difference between 2 and 3D. So it's testament to the fact that it is story that matters for the general public for the most part. But, and he was an IT guy. I don't know what to say about that. But I've noticed the layman, the non-trained artist, the public does comment on color. So these are examples of these abstract color bars. Often, especially when I went on 18 months early in pre-production, which was the case on Lion King and Tarzan both, I helped, generate early visual development art and the look of the backgrounds, but I also, actually everyone who came on eventually just helped crank out color bars, and then Andy would put them all together on a board and make some executive decisions and come up with the overall color script for the film. But we would start abstractly. It didn't matter whether this white was a negative space, whether, this brown was a rock or this green was a tree. It didn't matter. We just represented the emotional content as supported, the story arc, this story arc. So actually we would place them on a cork board, or you can do it virtually, but it's really fun to place your color keys per sequence, right? You've identified all your sequences, place them on this arc. I couldn't find any online to share with you, but we would always place them on the arc, see if it supported our goal. Okay, so these are examples of the color keys themselves. After we take these abstract color bars, which you see at the top here, we then make them figural, representational, and generally we would do one per sequence. In animation, a sequence is what we think of as a scene in live action. I don't want to confuse you. Sometimes if it was a montage, like in Hercules, let's say one of the songs demanded every single shot have a color key because it's a montage and it would really go to different places throughout, if that makes sense. So in a sequence, as long as most of the elements are represented in a color key and there are no surprises when the background comes through the background department, for example, you can get away with one color key for the sequence. Again, a song or a montage might require a little color key for every single shot within that sequence. But anyway, we'd take the abstract color bars like the ones you're seeing at the top, we would make them representational and turn them, again, one bar might become a rock or a cloud, the blue might become the sky, etc. We'd relate them to the content. These are examples of color keys. They can be as tight or loose as you like, as simple or complex as you like. Very simple, look at that, but it nails the tone, the mood, the feeling. No need for detail, in my opinion. These are a little more involved. These were for the background painters themselves. This is from Hercules. So this, again, together, they address sequences. The sequences together might end up looking like, that's a sequence, looking like this, the whole film. Okay, and again, imagine this placed on the arc. Does it support, as you can see, kind of calming in the very beginning, home, calming, familiarity. That's the exposition where you're sort of introducing the characters and developing the characters a little bit and establishing certain things. Then you'll probably have the inciting incident at some point. But as the conflict escalates and you get to the climax, you have the boldest color, probably more contrast, more disturbing color relationships that assault the eye and might have disturbing associations connected with them. And then usually, not the best example, but you have, as the denouement or the resolution occurs, you have more harmonious colors that literally feel more resolved. In music and color, you have harmony and you have discord. So a palette that's maybe more pastel-y in value, but certainly more harmonious, or even something like a triad or a split complement that's extremely harmonious might be appropriate for a denouement or a resolution, whereas here you want probably less harmony and more disturbing color relationships. Hope that makes sense. I'd like to go into some films. So again, it'll be maybe a little more clear-cut in terms of the practicality of everything we've talked about. So Sleeping Beauty, I think Tina and I have agreed it's probably one of the most well art directed films, cohesively art directed, if for no other reason than Ivan Roll personally trained all the background painters to adopt his look. He was already doing it in the galleries. I'll show you some images in 1 second. This is kind of what Ivan Roll was already up to, and Tina did an amazing retrospective at the gallery of his work. But this is kind of what he was already up to. And then it was a small leap to translate it to film for Sleeping Beauty. And he was the perfect person because a lot of the reference was very graphic. As we talked about, the stacked perspective with no convergence, very few overlaps. The ornate quality of all those motifs, right? Created a real lush visual style. So tapestries were looked at, medieval paintings with the stacked perspective, stained glass windows, illuminated manuscripts. I mean, the no-brainer is fairy tales are often associated with medieval times or even the Renaissance, and that should be enough right there. But last week we spoke about either literally using your research and your reference or applying it figuratively and using it in an inventive way. I want to go on to some images from the film to speak about the more inventive ways in which we use our research. So hopefully you already see the stacked perspective, the shape orientation, the almost geometric shape orientation. All of that comes from the research I just showed you. The patterning. Look at those beautiful, elegant trees in the background. That absolutely is a result of having looked at so many tapestries. I want to lick the screen. These are amazing. It's never gotten any better. Just my opinion. They had some talented illustrators on board back then, man. They had the best illustrators out there when animation came along. So here's an example. Do you see the research is necessary because you want to get those Gothic arches right. You want to get what the vaulted ceilings and the ribbed vaults and the flying buttresses. You got to get that right. Do you see those hanging tapestries? The iconography on them just has to be authentic and either create such a departure from reality that the fairy tale world exists in a vacuum, or honor it. So I think a lot of the research was used literally. The figurative ways in which it's used are what's more important. And we talked about the Greek key with Hercules. Yes, put it on pottery, put it on a fresco in the background, put it on moldings and chair rails, everywhere that it would logically be. But how about inventively, let's put it on, yes, his chest plate of his armor, because that's where it would logically be, but also his chin, his elbow, his knees, for no good reason at all, other than to create a cohesiveness and to create a convincing universe that exists inside of this screen. Sorry, I'm speaking so fast. I want to get through it all. Look at these when you get a chance. And if you ever see a screening on the big screen, it is so worth seeing a revival of this. Tina, any questions while I'm scrolling through these last images or comments?
There was a comment that says it's quite delicious.
I agree. I just hate to motor so quickly. It doesn't feel good, but I do want to get to some other stuff. Yeah, look at these when you get a chance. There's a great resource, if you want to put it on the list, called, and I'm sure you know of it, called Animation Backgrounds. It's animationbackgrounds.blogspot.com. And somebody with a lot of time on their hands would take production backgrounds. He'd actually take stills, freeze frame, and then he would rubber stamp or recreate the areas behind the character. So he would paint out the character so it's just the beautiful background as it probably looks in the ARL, the Animation Research Library.
These are wonderful resources. Hadn't heard of that, and also book finders.
Yeah, I mean, for people that are interested in backgrounds, it's wonderful. But I think backgrounds I am a background painter, but I do think they're obviously integral to the art direction, and they're the stage. If you think of them like a character, they're as important to the story as anything else, I think. So sometimes they get overlooked, but man, and actually, tell me how you feel about this, Tina. I always felt like, well, that's the one thing that literally appears untouched on screen as I painted it. I mean, sometimes they would throw them out of focus or would put a sort of rack focus on them or whatever. But within reason, like every other department, somebody cleans it up, somebody in betweens it, somebody gets, inks and paints it, somebody gets their hands on it. It was one of the few departments you could go to dailies and go, I recognize that, I painted that. It's kind of rewarding.
Absolutely. Somebody was asking about Hunchback, if you were painting those digitally or traditionally when you were showing the Hunchback.
All the films I worked on, Lion King, Pocahontas, Hunchback, Tarzan, Little Match Girl, and One by One, were all 2D, including the backgrounds. But Tarzan was the first film where we started integrating. We always had, as you know, Tina, a department called CGI, computer generated images. And I do a whole lecture on that we don't have time for, but it started with, the bell tower and McLeach's Bushwamper, and there was always certain props or assets that were done digitally, but it kind of took off. If you remember the Beauty and the Beast scene, the ballroom scene with the chandelier and the camera rotated 360 degrees, that was the first time we started mapping paintings on the geometry. And so what's called deep canvas came along on Tarzan, and that's where we painted directly on the wireframe. I almost showed a reel of that today. But anyway, that was our transition within 2D, not at Pixar. That was taking on its own trajectory. But within the 2D tradition at Disney Feature Animation, Tarzan was the first film where, as a background painter, we started painting digitally on the wireframe. And it wasn't even Photoshop. It was just a proprietary thing called Deep Canvas, which was based on Paint Tool, which was based on Draw Tool. Sorry for the long answer.
Yeah, amazing. I don't want to interrupt, but I'll just say that I've always said that during that time, Disney was the only studio on the planet doing the integration, like you were just describing. Pixar was completely 3D, others were 3D. Disney was the only studio on the planet doing that beautiful integration.
I'm sure you probably saw the wildebeest stampede downstairs at the El Capitan. There was a really great Scott something.
Johnston.
Yeah, I think he kind of manned that operation, and it really talked about the wildebeest stampede and that technology, which became the Hun attack, right? And I remember the same thing with Deep Canvas. It was groundbreaking at the time. And I tell my students when I speak about it, I say, well, now there's all kinds of versions, right? There's all kinds of versions of painting on the wireframe. Not at the time, it was pretty groundbreaking. But I agree, within the 2D pipeline, we were the only ones doing it.
Beautiful work.
See, now, I think Pocahontas was beautifully art directed. You can clearly see the Ivan Earl influence. I joke every single film I worked on, of course, Mary Blair is mentioned, Ivan Earl is mentioned, it's a no-brainer. But N.C. Wyeth is often mentioned, and then we come to our senses and go, yeah, we're not going to paint in oils because the fumes, the drying time. But we always joke, you know, fantasize we're going to paint in oils. Anyway, this one I really want to talk about because it comes from the horse's mouth. Mike gave me a really great example of, again, how that theoretical story stuff that we've been talking about, how the thematic content and the character arc and the story arc, all the stuff that sounds like blah, 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 how that becomes your art direction. It's probably the most clear-cut example I'm going to give you today. So what some of you may not know is on every film, within reason, you know, the art directors, the directors, the heads of certain departments, not all of them, and certainly not me, but the heads of the departments go on field trips. To Lion King, it was Africa, it was the savannah. For Virginia, not as exciting. I'm sorry, for Pocahontas, not as exciting, but it was Virginia. And Mike said, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but something like, well, yeah, we got there and the landscape was very stark, you know, it's pretty flat, just this horizon. And of course there was movement in the forest canopy, a lot of foliage, it's very green, but he said it was largely just this stark flat horizon and these telephone pole-like trees, very static if you think about it. Verticals and horizontals that parallel the edges of the picture plane are formal, they're static, there's no lyricism, movement, dynamics, if that makes sense. S-curves, C-curves, and diagonals are what excite the eye. So he did think, again, this is what I remember him saying, what am I going to do with that? It's very formal. Well, what he came to, again, ask him, but what he came to, I believe, is, well, if you look at the concept of Pocahontas, and this is universal, it's pretty inarguable. Even though Disney played with history, she didn't marry John Smith. She married an entirely different dude and ended up going back to England, as you probably know. And then I think there's speculation she died of a venereal disease. So clearly not the Disney version. But what is true historically is that several of the settlers at the time wrote accounts in their journals or diaries about this 14-year-old Indian maiden that came and did a cartwheel through our camp and brightened our day. She was a breath of fresh air to them because every day was drudgery. Every day was survival, almost like being a prisoner, you know, colonizing for the powers that be, but really no redemption, no beauty, no truth, no redemption. And she was it for them. It was so needed that she was that breath of fresh air. If you take it further in terms of the Native American value system versus the patriarchal imperialist values of just exploiting, including nature, it's the same thing. Whereas the true redemption in life, it's in the beauty and not in the survival. So he took all this formal shit, like verticals and horizontals, and said that's the drudgery and the survival and the imperialism and patriarchy. Within that, she is the S-curve, the C-curve, the lyrical element, diagonal. So her hair almost became a character. It should have had top billing. You'll see how in every frame, Even here you have verticals, even Grandmother Willow, she's a cool chick, but there's a reason her fronds, her willow, whatever you want to call those, the hanging vines from her bow are vertical. But every shot in which Pocahontas appears, her hair literally plays against the verticals and creates lyricism. And unfortunately, that one I just, that was for a video for Disney Interactive, I think. So that's the only, sadly, example I have of her hair playing against all those verticals. So I hope you see the idea. There are curves in the landscape, you know, those little ground planes have a little movement, and then the boughs of the trees have a little movement. But within reason, she's where all those curves belong. Okay. For Mulan, I just included because it's beautifully art directed. We talked enough about it last week, I think, how the woodblock prints, the Chinese watercolors, a lot of the traditional art for dynasties and decades came into play. But the most practical, I think, application of the research was not the literal ways in which it was used, but the figurative. So again, the concept of yin and yang really informed a consciousness, as we said last week, of positive and negative space. Look at it. Look at all that unused, simple, inactive area. There's a poetry and an elegance to it. This reserve is a big part of Sumi painting. It's been said like Chinese letter forms are the ideal in balance and movement, right? They're all little beautiful compositions in themselves as letter forms. So the yin yang symbol is the ultimate in balance with movement. It's 50-50, but it ain't static. It's got that S curve. So anyway, just look for a consciousness of positive and negative space. Look for that reserve. This is very minimal and poetic because of it. Same here. This is just obviously visual development, pre-production art. Actually, I think these two are from Kung Fu Panda. Sorry, I cheated. I just loved him, so I threw him in there. I'm really speeding it up here. Sorry if you're getting whiplash. This is remember the Hunchback example we picked apart? I usually do this one right after the Hunchback example. And again, I told you I had my students, you know, interpret that Hunchback image as just a black and white icon, figure ground relationship, positive and negative space. All the feeling can be in a simple icon like that and should be. It's the same with character design. In gaming, more so than feature, you do start with silhouettes. The higher ups get it. They understand silhouettes because the minute you get to a level, you might have a sound cue telling you the boss is in the area of that level, but more importantly, the minute they appear, you want to have that feeling. So silhouettes are really understood in gaming. I know character designers and visual development artists in animation that aren't so keen on them. They think, draw the thing, draw the interior details. But I think they serve a purpose because if you can get a lineup of characters to read in accordance with one another, if you can get the villain to feel menacing with a simple silhouette, next to a more curvilinear protagonist that's non-threatening and inviting, you're in great shape when you get to those details. So we do the same with environments or backgrounds. So in this example, there we go. In this example, notice it's pyramidal, just like the Hunchback one. It's largely the same composition. I ask my students, because their list of adjectives here is not oppressive, menacing, threatening. It's none of those things. It's zen, peaceful, organic, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. It is partially the content. It's hard to tune out what you know, which is this is a shrine in a Zen garden. But if you try to get the intellectual mind out of the equation, the reason is because that pyramid is not exploited in the figure ground relationship. It is not the first read. Do you see how that pyramid is shrouded in other midtones and values? So there's a comfort to that. It's also composed entirely of S curves and C curves, this entire composition. Even the shrine itself, you could say, oh, those are pointy, man, those are pointy, right? That roof is pointy. But how about those negative spaces are very curvilinear? Like in between the points, there's literally C curves. So something about the inversion of the pyramid and the fact that it's shrouded in midtones, and that even those points on that shrine, it's not exploited in the first read. It's the first read that matters. Hope that makes sense. Okay, we're gonna, I'm including these because I just think, since I've enrolled, this is as good as it gets, just my opinion. Don't want to go on and on, but shape design, flawless. I kind of briefly mentioned straights to curves, stretch to compression, straights, short strokes playing against long strokes. These are all kind of gold in shape design. I also feel, just my opinion, that in this film, there's a simplicity to the color, but so much truth being spoken, right? The subtle warm cool relationships, the saturation control, it all comes together with no fussing, just minimalism. Shape design and color, it just came together. I've never seen anything as flawlessly art directed. See how iconic, I mean, not everything needs to be silhouetted. There, if we had more time, we go into the pool of light approach. There's many ways of lighting a scene, but this could read from Cleveland. So I will say every image, every shot of every scene, of every sequence, of every film Disney has ever made, the decision is made straight out the gate. Is it going to be light over dark or dark over light? Are the characters going to read light over dark or dark over light? Even if we call it a tone in animation, even if there's a form shadow indicating lighting, which brings out volume and form, and for many, many films, for many decades, there was a tone, a form shadow. But even if that's the case, a decision is still made light over dark or dark over light. These are the things we would go into more detail if we run a class. I've got a whole slide lecture on that. But just think about when you're setting up a scene, if it's from a storyboard panel, if it's you're starting from square one and roughing it out, think about a strong, iconic approach to the staging is what I call it. Then when you get into midtones, you know, it's only gonna fall apart more when you start putting midtones in there. You've got a strong icon to begin with, you can erode it with volume and rendering and modeling and all those useless things. I'm being a little facetious. Anyone licking their screen yet?
Right?
I don't know, Tina. Do you like this? I just think it's Ivan Earl on crack.
Right?
Okay, I will motor through just for inspiration. And this can be in the supplemental reading or the resource list also. This is why it takes 14 weeks, because just when we buckle down and deal with primary characters, there's a lot to think about. And it's not to overwhelm, but these are good tools to have in your toolbox. It's just, we can only do a sampler platter today. But these are some of the things I ask my students to think about in the character design phase. And I'm just including some of my favorites. Just for fun, a little interaction. I do have more slides. But tell me what he projects, whether you've seen the movie or not. Does this guy project anything? So while we're doing this, start putting him in the chat. But imagine this guy can be at a birthday party and be happy. He can also go to a funeral and be sad. But what does his design project? Not the default pose, not the default, like you've heard of resting bitch face. Like everybody has, even in default, they might project something. So regardless of his pose, what does the design itself inherently project? Anything? It's hard to tune out the facial expression and the gesture, but curious if he projects anything.
Someone says confidence, strength, maybe cocky, friendliness, solid, joy.
Right. Yep, I agree. And, it is so hard to tune out. We're so human, right? Facial expressions, gesture, even story details, hard to tune out. But imagine if you silhouetted this, just black and white. A lot would be lost, right? He's shrouded in this huge fur, but it would still be pyramidal. It would still be solid. It would still be bottom heavy. Probably some of those adjectives would still come up. Love these. It always makes me laugh.
About the other one, someone said, I think it's presenting a bear. Yeah, the big guy. Yeah, somebody said, I think it's presenting a bear.
I don't know what that means. Presenting a bear. Oh, well, yeah, he's meant to. That was probably part of the idea.
Yeah,
right?
big bear.
Mm. He just was one of the most, appeal is a word that comes up a lot in animation, right, Tina? It's not always likability or charm, but it's appeal. It's
Yes.
huge in animation. I find him, because the range of expression he's capable of is almost like the Beast, that beautiful scene in Beauty and the Beast where everything just drops. It's often used as, the quintessential squash and stretch illustration. Look at that. She's all right, but he's very charming. So here I have groups. You'll see some silhouettes in a moment, but it's all about how they read in relation to one another. I think 2 weeks ago, I mentioned Stanley and Streetcar Named Desire. You may remember that. It's a Tennessee Williams classic play and a movie. And most people that play Stanley say, look, I don't have to do much. He is an alpha male. He's the symbol of patriarchy. He abuses everyone in his world, but he really doesn't have to raise his voice. And it's because it's the way the other characters react to him. And a lot of mob bosses are played that way, right? How they talk above a whisper, but everybody does their bidding. So think of it that way, it's all about how the characters read in relationship to one another. If your film is angular and that's the world you've created, one little curve in all of that is going to go a long way. So size comparison charts are one thing, but comparing shape language, volume, basic shape orientation, all of that as a silhouette is kind of your best friend at the outset. Sorry for the low res ones. I love these guys. And, there's a lot to know too. When I design for CG, there's often things that will get compromised. There are blend shapes, and I think it's getting better and better, but, harsh angles are really hard to pull off. So even I learned very early on, like I used to put really spindly legs and arms on my characters, and I was told, no, that's going to strobe on screen. When it gets small enough to be one row of pixels, it's going to strobe. So there's all kinds of reasons they have a look, in Disney, DreamWorks, PDI, Pixar, Sony, they do have a look across the board, and it's usually technical limitations that are the reason for it. It's getting way better. And the squash and stretch came along with The Incredibles, and I think the diversity of character designs that are being done now is much greater. I mean, if you look at some of the early humans in Toy Story, remember like 1 and 2, it was like, no, don't show humans, please, no. There's a reason a lot of the early films, you had toys. Think about it. What did you see in early CG films? Toys, bugs, cars, things that didn't expose the limitations of the technology. It was actually very smart. Humans came around. I love Leica. I love everything they do personally. I actually did I almost showed this reel too. I did all the paint color, rough color, and then the paint overs themselves on the model for a lot of these guys. Love Ratatouille, just imposing my tastes. She you should check her out. She's a great character and for many, many reasons. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. Maybe I'll show some of this next week. Ah, he's great too. Look at this guy for interior shapes. Do you see, again, if you silhouetted this, everything you could ever want is in that shape. A sort of gesture to the shape itself, straights to curves, short strokes to long strokes, stretch to compression, meaning the stretch on the right side of the shape and the complexity or the compression on the other side. But how about the lines within it? Beautifully designed. One shape inside it. You've probably had people kind of press this issue with modeling. You start with basic shapes and you add more complex forms on top of it. It's no different when drawing. You think of the basic shapes first and you sort of add shapes to it, but they have to play well together. That's what I love about this one. Carter Goodrich, you guys know him?
Yeah, of course.
So much life in these. Oh my God. That one always makes me laugh. Just a mess. Oh, and then sculpts. I mean, I've gotten to the point in a character design where like, you can do facial expressions and you kind of know what's bone, what's not going to be malleable, where can I get away with the squash and stretch that actually lends life to animation. But it goes off model very quickly. I mean, I've learned a lot with my students, like that ellipse changes when you lean forward and tilt back, but eyes don't get closer together and far apart. They might change angle when you tilt your head. But if that makes sense, the first thing that throws things off model is eyes floating farther apart and closer together. But anyway, I always get to a point where it is necessary to do a little sculpt sometimes to, I'm contradicting myself, always, sometimes. Doing a little sculpt can help you really get to know the form from different angles. Here are some examples of that first read that you might want to start with these for any and all character designs. Okay, I think that's enough for today, Tina. I'm going to unshare my screen.
That was incredible. What a bunch of visual eye candy and knowledge.
I'm glad.
Amazing.
Thank you for your participation. Bye, guys.